Look at the dense, sprawling skyline of modern Mumbai. It looks incredibly solid. But beneath all that concrete, this metropolis is an entirely man-made illusion. This map shows what the region actually looked like centuries ago. If we roll back the clock, the unified landmass splinters apart into an archipelago of 7 isolated, marshy islands, surrounded by the Arabian Sea. For generations, the only people living on these scattered mudflats were the indigenous Koli and Agri tribes. They were mostly fishing communities, following their own local customs, completely cut off from the global trade networks buzzing just over the horizon. That deep isolation kept the islands quiet until the 1300s. Suddenly, expanding empires realized these fragmented swamps were positioned exactly where they needed a port, turning this quiet archipelago into some of the most contested real estate on Earth. The Delhi Sultanate, and later the Gujarat Sultanate, expanded into the area and recognized a crucial geographic advantage. These islands sat perfectly along the Arabian Sea, offering a naturally sheltered launchpad for merchant ships. The local tribes were suddenly living in the middle of a heavily militarized zone. The islands became a high-stakes bargaining chip for regional rulers trying to consolidate power along the coast. Then, in the early 1500s, Portuguese explorers sailed into the harbor. They were aggressively mapping the Indian coast, looking for deep-water outposts to lock down a strict monopoly over the highly lucrative global spice trade. The swamps were now a prime target. Whoever controlled this specific cluster of islands could effectively dictate the terms of trade flowing between the eastern markets and Western Europe. By the 1530s, the ruler of the Gujarat Sultanate, Bahadur Shah, found himself trapped. The massive Mughal Empire, led by Emperor Humayun, was expanding fast and threatening to crush Bahadur Shah's territory. The Portuguese saw his panic and moved in. They offered him military protection from the incoming Mughal army, but they attached a massive, non-negotiable price tag to their naval support. Under intense pressure, Bahadur Shah signed the Treaty of Bassein in 1534. He handed over complete ownership of the 7 islands to the Portuguese crown in exchange for an alliance. Upon taking physical control of the archipelago, the Portuguese assessed the deep, sheltered waters between the islands and gave their new prize a fitting name, Bombay, which translates directly to Good Bay. Through an act of calculated diplomatic extortion, local rule evaporated. The islands were officially absorbed into the sprawling European imperial machine. Fast forward a century, and the Portuguese were the ones panicking. The Dutch Empire was aggressively expanding across the Indian Ocean, systematically dismantling the Portuguese spice monopoly and stripping away their profits. Desperate to block the Dutch from advancing further into India, the Portuguese realized they needed immediate naval backup. They turned to the English crown to forge a defensive alliance. Look at this map of the region drawn shortly after the British arrived. In 1661, to seal this new alliance, the Portuguese arranged a marriage between Princess Catherine of Braganza and England's King Charles II. They literally packaged this fragmented territory, labeled here as Bombay I, along with its surrounding islands, and handed it to the British as a royal dowry. King Charles II looked at the map, saw a disconnected, swampy headache halfway across the world, and decided he didn't want to deal with it. In 1668, he leased the entire archipelago to the East India Company for a trivial £10 a year. The East India Company didn't have to fire a single shot or launch a massive invasion. They rented a global choke point on a landlord's discount, setting up what would become the largest corporate takeover of Indian trade in history. But the company immediately hit a logistical wall. Operating a trade hub across 7 disconnected islands meant relying on small boats to move goods and people. Every time the monsoons hit or the tide swelled, those boats were destroyed, bringing trade to a complete halt. On top of the severe weather, the isolated outposts were sitting ducks for regional naval attacks from Maratha and Mughal fleets. The company desperately needed a unified, easily defensible stronghold. In 1782, the newly appointed governor, William Hornby, looked at the disjointed map and proposed a radical solution, the Hornby-Vellard Reclamation Project. This diagram shows exactly how they did it. Over the next 6 decades, engineers and laborers systematically dumped massive amounts of stone, soil, and debris directly into the oceanic gaps between the islands, physically blocking out the sea. By 1845, the gaps were entirely filled. The isolated mudflats were gone, replaced by a single, continuous, solid peninsula extending out into the Arabian Sea. The East India Company bankrolled and executed this massive terraforming project for a single, non-negotiable reason: to insulate their corporate supply chains from the sea. As this archival image of the harbor front illustrates, the newly unified landmass was quickly covered in factories, warehouses, and docks. The British turned the peninsula into a massive storage hub to hold raw cotton, spices, and metals looted from across the Indian subcontinent. To move those extracted goods even faster, the company began laying down tracks. In 1853, India's first passenger train made its run between Boribandar and Thane, explicitly designed to accelerate the funneling of inland resources straight to the awaiting cargo ships. Following the 1857 rebellion, the British Crown took direct control from the company. They began constructing imposing structures, like the Victoria Terminus, designed to project a permanent sense of imperial power over the local population. The rapid construction required vast amounts of prime real estate. To clear the land for these elite British strongholds and administrative centers, thousands of local Indian artisans and workers were forcibly displaced, rendered homeless almost overnight. The British designed this rapid urbanization as a specialized extraction engine, methodically siphoning Indian wealth toward Europe. When India finally gained independence in 1947, the massive port infrastructure remained. The city transitioned from a colonial extraction hub into the primary economic engine of a newly free nation. But the wealth generated by that engine sparked intense internal conflicts. Economic control was heavily concentrated in the Gujarati community, creating deep resentment among the Marathi-speaking population, which erupted into widespread protests throughout the late 1950s. The friction reached a breaking point. In 1960, the Indian government officially partitioned the larger Bombay state into 2 distinct territories, Gujarat and Maharashtra, cementing the city as the capital of the newly formed Maharashtra state. Then, in 1995, the city underwent a final act of decolonization. It formally shed the anglicized imperial title of Bombay and reclaimed its indigenous name, Mumbai. Slowing down. Mumbai stands today as a monument to human defiance, a massive metropolis literally stitched together from 7 isolated swamps to become the undeniable heartbeat of India.